The flames licked the night sky, consuming everything Asher Sullivan had built over the past 5 years, as he stood helplessly watching his ranch house, barn, and life's work disintegrate into ash and embers. It was 1876 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and as the crackling heat singed his face and the smoke burned his lungs, he knew that by dawn, nothing would remain of the Silver Creek Ranch. "Stand back, Sullivan," Sheriff Tanner yelled, pulling Asher away from the inferno as part of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. "There's nothing more to be done here." But Asher couldn't move, his boots seemingly rooted to the hard, packed earth, as the fire consumed not just his property, but the future he had painstakingly built after the war. His cattle, his horses, the tools of his trade, his home all gone in the merciless dance of flames against the star-speckled Wyoming sky. "The horses," he muttered, his voice raw from smoke and despair. "Did anyone get the horses out?" Sheriff Tanner's silence was answer enough. The barn had been the first to go, and with it, the prized quarter horses Asher had been breeding and training, horses that represented his livelihood and pride. "I'm sorry, son," the older man finally said, his hand firm on Asher's shoulder. "It spread too fast. Jenkins said he thinks it was lightning that struck the barn. Storm came through while you were in town." But Asher barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the burning remains of the small desk by the window where he kept his mother's Bible, and his father's pocket watched the only mementos he had of the family he'd lost to cholera when he was 16. Now, at 31, he was alone again, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the meager contents of his saddlebags. By morning, when the fire had finally exhausted itself, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins and the acrid smell of destruction, the neighboring ranchers who had come to help had drifted away, leaving Asher to confront the devastation alone. The sun rose over a blackened landscape that bore no resemblance to the thriving ranch he had left just the day before. He stood among the ashes, his tall frame bent with exhaustion, his face streaked with soot, and the tracks of tears he would deny shedding. His dark hair hung limply around a face that had aged overnight, and his usually vibrant blue eyes were dull with shock. The ranch that had been his pride, his legacy, was gone, and with it, his purpose. Asher. The soft voice behind him belonged to Josie Valenti, the school teacher from Wilson, the nearest town. She stood at what had once been his gate, her honey-brown hair pulled back from her face, her green eyes wide with concern. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, approaching cautiously as if he were a wounded animal that might bolt. "Sheriff Tanner told me what happened." Asher barely acknowledged her presence, his gaze still fixed on the smoldering ruins. Josie had arrived in Wilson just 6 months ago, bringing with her fresh ideas and a gentle determination that had won over even the most stubborn of the town's residents. She taught at the small schoolhouse on the edge of town and boarded with the widow Carson, attending church every Sunday and bringing books to the homebound. She was well-liked, respected, and entirely too optimistic for Asher's current state of mind. "I'm fine, Miss Valenti," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. "Just figuring out what to do next." "And what have you figured out?" she asked, stepping closer, seemingly unaffected by his attempt to dismiss her. Asher finally turned to look at her, his expression hard. "That there's nothing left for me here. I'm heading west, maybe to Montana or Idaho. Start fresh." Josie frowned, her delicate features settling into a look of determination. "That's your plan? To run away?" Her words stung, hitting a nerve Asher didn't know was exposed. "I'm not running," he snapped. "I'm being practical. I've got nothing left here. You have land," she countered immediately. "You have neighbors who respect you, a community that needs you. And you have faith, Asher Sullivan, whether you remember it or not. Asher laughed bitterly. Faith. In what, Miss Valenti? A God that would take everything from me. Twice. Josie didn't flinch at his anger. Instead, she moved to stand directly in front of him, her 5'4" frame dwarfed by his 6'2", but her presence somehow filling the space between them. Faith in yourself, she said quietly. Faith in the goodness of people, faith that tomorrow can be better than today. Pretty words, Asher said dismissively. But words don't rebuild a barn or replace a herd. No, she agreed. Hard work does that. And I've never known you to shy away from hard work, Mr. Sullivan. Before Asher could respond, Sheriff Tanner rode up, his expression grim. Sullivan, he called, dismounting. Just came from town. Bank says with the fire and all, they're foreclosing on your loan. Say you've got 2 weeks to come up with the payment or they're selling the land. Asher felt the last thread of his composure snap. They can't do that, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. This land is mine. I've made every payment on time until now. It's Hollister, the sheriff said, referring to the bank manager, a man known for his ruthless business practices. Says the collateral for the loan is gone with the fire. Property's devalued. He's calling it in. 2 weeks, Asher repeated, the words bitter in his mouth. To come up with money I don't have, to save land I can't work without tools or stock. I'm sorry, Asher, Sheriff Tanner said, genuinely regretful. I tried to reason with him, but you know how he is. As the sheriff rode away, the silence between Asher and Josie stretched taut with unspoken words. Finally, she broke it. You can stay at the Carson place, she said decisively. Mrs. Carson has that room she never uses, and she's always saying she misses having a man around to help with the heavy work. I don't need charity, Asher said stiffly. Good, because I'm not offering any, Josie retorted. I'm offering a fair exchange, a room for work. And while you're there, we can figure out how to save your land. Asher raised an eyebrow. I don't recall asking for your help, Miss Valenti. No, you didn't, she agreed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. But you're getting it anyway. Now, gather whatever you have left and come with me. Mrs. Carson is expecting us for supper, and she makes the best apple pie in the territory. Asher wanted to refuse, to hold onto his pride and his anger. But as he looked around at the charred remains of his life, he realized he had nowhere else to go. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of grief and loss, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope flickered to life. Fine, he conceded grudgingly, but just for tonight. Tomorrow I'll figure something out on my own. Josie's smile widened. Of course you will, she said, in a tone that suggested she didn't believe him for a second. Now come on, it's a long walk to town and I'm hungry. As they began the trek to Wilson, Asher cast one last look over his shoulder at the ruined ranch. It had taken 5 years to build it up from nothing. Could he do it again in 2 weeks? It seemed impossible. But as Josie walked beside him, her step light despite the gravity of the situation, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was right about having faith. Mrs. Carson, a plump, gray-haired widow with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, welcomed Asher with a brisk efficiency that brooked no argument. She showed him to a small but clean room at the back of her modest house, pressed a fresh towel and a bar of soap into his hands, and informed him that supper would be ready in 30 minutes. And I expect you at the table looking presentable, young man. Asher found himself obeying without question, washing away the soot and grime of the fire in the small washroom off the kitchen. The cold water was a shock to his system, but a welcome one, clearing his head and forcing him to focus on the present rather than the past or the uncertain future. When he emerged, dressed in the spare shirt Mrs. Carson had somehow produced, likely belonging to her late husband. He found Josie setting the table, her movements quick and efficient. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening at the sight of him clean and somewhat restored. "You look more like yourself," she said simply, placing a third plate at the small round table. "And how would you know what I look like?" Asher asked, not unkindly. "We've barely spoken before today." Josie smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "I'm observant, Mr. Sullivan. It's part of being a teacher, and everyone in Wilson knows the handsome rancher from Silver Creek." Before Asher could respond to the unexpected compliment, Mrs. Carson bustled in with a steaming pot of stew, effectively ending the moment. Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair, with Mrs. Carson dominating the conversation, updating Josie on the town gossip, and pointedly not asking Asher about the fire. By the time she served the promised apple pie, which was, indeed, the best Asher had ever tasted, he found his shoulders had relaxed, and the knot of tension in his chest had loosened slightly. "Now," Mrs. Carson said, pouring coffee for all of them, "let's talk about what's to be done." "Madam, I appreciate the meal and the room, but—" Asher began, only to be cut off by a wave of Mrs. Carson's hand. "Nonsense. You need help and we're offering it. That's what neighbors do." "I'm not your neighbor," Asher pointed out. "Everyone in Wilson is my neighbor," Mrs. Carson said firmly. "And I don't turn my back on neighbors in need." "What Mr. Sullivan means," Josie interjected smoothly, "is that he's not used to accepting help. He's been on his own a long time." Mrs. Carson's expression softened. "Too long by the looks of it. Well, that ends now. You'll stay here until you get back on your feet, and that's final." Asher opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, recognizing the futility. "Thank you," he said instead, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. "I'll pay you back." "You most certainly will," Mrs. Carson agreed. "Starting tomorrow, there's a shed that needs re-roofing and a fence that's falling down. I've been meaning to hire someone, but now I don't have to." Asher nodded, a fair exchange being something he could accept more easily than outright charity. "But that doesn't solve the bigger problem," he said, returning to the reality of his situation. 2 weeks to come up with enough money to save the ranch." Josie, who had been quietly sipping her coffee, set her cup down with a decisive clink. "We'll have a fundraiser," she announced. "A what?" Asher and Mrs. Carson asked in unison. "A fundraiser," Josie repeated. "Back east, when someone in the community was in trouble, we would often hold events to raise money, dances, auctions, bake sales. People would contribute what they could, and together it would often be enough to make a difference." Asher shook his head. "I can't ask the people of Wilson to give me their hard-earned money." "You're not asking," Josie pointed out. "I am. And they won't be giving it to you, they'll be investing in the future of this community. Your ranch employs people, provides meat and horses, contributes to the economy of Wilson. It's in everyone's interest to see it rebuilt." "She has a point, Mr. Sullivan," Mrs. Carson said thoughtfully. "And people around here like you, they'd want to help." "It wouldn't be enough," Asher argued, though he could feel his resolve weakening. "The bank wants the full payment, that's nearly $1,000. No fundraiser in a town this size could raise that kind of money." "Maybe not," Josie conceded, "but it could be a start. And if people see you're committed to staying, to rebuilding, maybe Mr. Hollister at the bank might be persuaded to extend the deadline." Asher considered her words, turning the idea over in his mind. It seemed far-fetched, a desperate plan born of optimism rather than reality. But what alternative did he have? Ride away and leave behind the land he'd poured his heart and soul into? "I'll think about it," he finally said, unwilling to commit but equally unwilling to dismiss the idea outright. Josie's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "That's all I ask," she said softly. "For now." Later that night, lying on the unfamiliar bed in Mrs. Carson's spare room, Asher stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what he'd lost and what lay ahead. The logical part of him knew he should cut his losses, take what little money he had saved, and start fresh somewhere else. The West was full of opportunities for a man willing to work hard. But another part of him, a part he thought had died along with his parents, rebelled at the idea of giving up. That part whispered that Josie might be right, that with faith and community, he might find a way to rebuild what was lost. As he drifted towards an exhausted sleep, Asher found himself praying for the first time in years, not for a miracle, but for the strength to face tomorrow, whatever it might bring. Morning brought with it a clarity that had been missing in the chaos of the previous day. Asher rose early, as was his habit, and found Mrs. Carson already in the kitchen, preparing a breakfast that could have fed a family of 6. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," she said cheerfully. "Sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you," Asher replied, automatically reaching for the coffee pot to pour himself a cup. "And please call me Asher," Mrs. Carson nodded approvingly. "Asher it is, then, and I'm Martha. Mrs. Carson makes me feel like I'm teaching school again. You were a teacher?" Asher asked, surprised. "For 20 years before I married Mr. Carson and moved out west," she confirmed. "Teaching and preaching were the family trades." Before Asher could respond, Josie appeared in the doorway, her hair braided neatly, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the green of her eyes. "Good morning," she said, looking remarkably fresh for someone who must have been up half the night planning. "Josie," Martha acknowledged with a nod. "I was just telling Asher here about my teaching days." "Which is appropriate," Josie said, accepting a cup of coffee from Asher with a grateful smile, "because I'm going to need your help with the fundraiser." "So we're doing this then?" Asher asked, raising an eyebrow. "We are," Josie confirmed, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I've been thinking about it all night, and I believe a series of events rather than just one will be most effective." "A series?" Martha echoed, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits in front of each of them. "Yes," Josie said, warming to her topic as she spread jam on a biscuit. "Starting with a town meeting to explain the situation and gather initial donations, followed by a ladies' bake sale this weekend, and culminating in a dance and auction the weekend after. You've got it all planned out, haven't you?" Asher said, torn between admiration and irritation at her presumption. "Someone has to," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "And you were too busy feeling sorry for yourself." Martha choked on her coffee, trying to hide a laugh, while Asher stared at Josie in astonishment. The prim school teacher had claws, it seemed. "I was not," he began, then stopped, recognizing the truth in her words. "Fine. What do you need me to do?" "First, we need to assess exactly what was lost and what's needed to rebuild," Josie said, clearly prepared for this conversation. "Then we need to speak with Sheriff Tanner about organizing the town meeting. And you need to go see Mr. Hollister at the bank to make sure he understands you're committed to saving your ranch." "That's a lot for one day," Asher observed. "We have 13 days left," Josie reminded him. "Every moment counts." After breakfast, they parted ways, Martha to spread the word about the upcoming fundraiser among her extensive network of friends, Josie to speak with Sheriff Tanner, and Asher, reluctantly, to face Mr. Hollister at the bank. The Wyoming Territorial Bank of Wilson was a solid stone building on the main street, its imposing facade designed to inspire confidence in its stability. Asher, who had always conducted his business there with straightforward honesty, found himself hesitating at the entrance, uncomfortable in his borrowed clothes, and aware of the curious glances from townspeople who had heard about the fire. Mr. Sullivan, the bank teller, Miss Pemberton, greeted him with a sympathetic smile. "We were so sorry to hear about your ranch. Is there anything we can do?" "I need to speak with Mr. Hollister," Asher said, his voice gruffer than intended. "Of course," Miss Pemberton replied, her smile fading slightly. "I'll see if he's available." Moments later, Asher was shown into Hollister's office, a wood-paneled room dominated by a large desk and the imposing presence of the bank manager himself. Franklin Hollister was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and a perpetual frown, known throughout the county for his strict adherence to the letter of financial law. "Sullivan," Hollister acknowledged without rising. "I assume you're here about the loan." "I am," Asher confirmed, remaining standing since no seat was offered. "I understand you're calling it in due to the fire." "The collateral has been destroyed," Hollister said matter-of-factly. "The bank must protect its investments." "The land is still there," Asher pointed out. "And I've never missed a payment." "Until now," Hollister countered. "And without the ranch operational, how do you propose to continue making payments?" "I'm going to rebuild," Asher said firmly. "The town is rallying behind me. We're organizing a fundraiser." Hollister's thin lips curved in what might generously be called a smile. "How? Quaint. And how much do you expect this fundraiser to raise?" "Enough to cover the remaining balance of nearly $1,000. The doubt in his voice was palpable, and Asher felt his resolve waver. $1,000 was a fortune in a small town like Wilson. "I'm asking for more time," Asher said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "Another month, at least, to get the ranch operational again." Hollister leaned back in his chair, studying Asher with calculating eyes. "I might consider an extension," he said slowly, "if you had a substantial down payment to offer as a show of good faith. Say, half the balance." "Half," Asher repeated, his hope deflating. "That's still $500. "Indeed it is," Hollister agreed, a smug satisfaction in his tone. "Bring me $500 within the 2 weeks, and I'll extend your deadline for the remainder by 30 days. It was both a concession and an impossibility, and Hollister knew it. $500 might as well have been $5,000 for all the chance Asher had of raising it in 2 weeks. "I'll think about it," Asher said finally, unwilling to give Hollister the satisfaction of seeing his despair. "Do that," Hollister replied dismissively, already turning his attention back to the papers on his desk. "Good day, Mr. Sullivan." Outside, the bright Wyoming sunshine seemed to mock Asher's darkening mood. $500 in 2 weeks. It was impossible. The fundraiser had been a foolish hope, a child's fantasy of community spirit overcoming harsh reality. "Asher," he turned to see Josie hurrying towards him, her expression bright with excitement. "I spoke with Sheriff Tanner," she called as she approached. "He's agreed to host the town meeting tonight at 7 in the church. How did it go with Hollister?" Asher hesitated, reluctant to dampen her enthusiasm, but he had never been one to sugarcoat the truth. "Not well," he admitted. "He says he'll extend the deadline if I can come up with half the balance, $500, in the next 2 weeks. Josie's smile faltered, but only momentarily. "Well, that's actually good news," she said, surprising him. "Now we have a concrete goal to work towards." "Good news?" Asher repeated incredulously. "Josie, $500 is a challenge," she interrupted firmly, "but not impossible. People in this town care about you, Asher, more than you realize." "Not $500 worth," he muttered. Josie surprised him by taking his hand, her smaller one warm against his calloused palm. "Have a little faith," she said softly. "In them, if not in yourself. Now come on, we have a meeting to prepare for." As they walked together down the main street of Wilson, Asher found himself studying Josie from the corner of his eye. She was pretty, certainly, with her heart-shaped face and expressive green eyes. But it was her determination, her unwavering optimism in the face of overwhelming odds, that he found most compelling. In the short time he had truly known her, beyond the polite nods exchanged in town, she had shown a strength of character that both challenged and intrigued him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. "Why go to all this trouble for someone you barely know?" Josie stopped as well, turning to face him fully. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. "Because no one should face this kind of loss alone. And because I've seen what you've built, Asher Sullivan, and I believe it's worth saving." Her words struck him like a physical blow, cutting through the layers of cynicism and self-protection he had built around himself since his parents' deaths. In that moment, looking into her earnest face, Asher felt something shift within him, a realization that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he had thought. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words inadequate but sincere. Josie smiled, a soft, understanding expression that made her even more beautiful. "You're welcome," she replied. "Now let's go save your ranch." The town meeting that evening exceeded all of Asher's expectations. The small church was packed, with nearly every resident of Wilson in attendance, from the wealthiest merchants to the poorest laborers. Sheriff Tanner called the meeting to order, explaining the situation in brief, straightforward terms, before turning the floor over to Josie. She stood before the crowd with confidence, her voice clear and passionate as she outlined the plan to save Silver Creek Ranch. Asher, sitting uncomfortably in the front pew, watched in amazement as she transformed his personal tragedy into a community cause. "This isn't just about one man's ranch," she told them. "It's about what kind of community we want to be. Do we turn our backs on a neighbor in need, or do we come together to help one of our own rebuild? Mr. Sullivan has contributed to this town for years, employing our young men, supporting our businesses, bringing his stock to our fairs. Now it's our turn to support him." Her words resonated through the church, and Asher could see heads nodding in agreement. When she laid out the fundraising plan, the bake sale, the dance, the auction, there was an immediate response, with people volunteering items, services, and time. "We need to raise $500 in 2 weeks, Josie concluded. "It's a substantial sum, but not impossible if we all contribute what we can." To Asher's surprise, the first to stand was Tom Jenkins, owner of the general store and notoriously tight with his money. "I'll donate $20, he announced, "and credit at the store for building supplies." Others followed quickly. Mrs. Peterson from the dress shop offered $10 and fabric for the dance decorations. Old Mr. Crawford, who ran the livery, promised the loan of horses and wagons. The Mendoza family, who owned the local restaurant, volunteered to provide food for the dance. By the end of the meeting, they had collected nearly $100 in cash donations and promises of much more in goods and services. It was a start, a far better one than Asher had dared to hope for, but still well short of their goal. As the meeting dispersed, Sheriff Tanner approached Asher with a rare smile. "Looks like you've got quite an advocate in Miss Valenti," he observed, nodding towards Josie, who was deep in conversation with a group of women planning the bake sale. "She's got this town fired up to help you. She's remarkable," Asher admitted, his eyes lingering on Josie's animated face. "That she is," the sheriff agreed, a knowing look in his eye. "And smart, too. This fundraiser of hers might just work." "Maybe," Asher said, still cautious but feeling the first real stirrings of hope. "But we've got a long way to go." "Well, you're not doing it alone anymore," Sheriff Tanner pointed out. "That's something, at least." As the church emptied, Josie finally made her way back to Asher, her face flushed with excitement. "What did I tell you?" she said triumphantly. People want to help. You were right, Asher conceded, finding it increasingly difficult to maintain his pessimism in the face of her enthusiasm. But we're still a long way from $500. Rome wasn't built in a day, Mr. Sullivan, she replied with a teasing smile. But it was built, and so will your ranch be. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Asher divided his time between working for Martha Carson to pay for his room and board, helping with the fundraiser preparations, and making daily trips to his ranch to assess the damage and begin the monumental task of clearing away the debris. To his surprise, he was rarely alone in these efforts. Men from town would appear, seemingly at random, to offer a few hours of labor before returning to their own work. Women arrived with baskets of food and jugs of lemonade for the workers. Children came with their parents, gathering unburnt wood that could be reused and helping to sort through the salvageable items. And always, there was Josie, organizing, encouraging, and working alongside everyone else despite her teaching duties. She seemed tireless, her faith in the eventual success of their endeavor never wavering, even when progress seemed slow. The bake sale, held the Saturday after the town meeting, raised another $75, an impressive sum for such an event, but still far short of what they needed. As they counted the money afterward in Martha's kitchen, Asher could feel his hope beginning to fade again. "It's not enough," he said, staring at the small pile of bills and coins. "At this rate, we won't even make half of what we need by the deadline." "The dance is next weekend," Josie reminded him, unfazed by his pessimism. "That's where the real money will come in. People are already donating items for the auction, good items, Asher, valuable ones." "And if it's still not enough," he asked, voicing the fear that had been haunting him. Josie reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Then we'll figure something else out," she said firmly. "But I believe it will be enough. You just need to trust me." And strangely, despite all evidence to the contrary, Asher found that he did trust her. Somewhere along the way, between the town meeting and the countless hours they had spent working side by side, Josie Valenti had become not just his advocate, but his friend, perhaps his closest friend since returning from the war. He turned his hand beneath hers, interlacing their fingers in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "I do trust you," he said quietly, "more than I've trusted anyone in a long time." Josie's smile was soft, her green eyes warm with an emotion Asher was afraid to name. "Good," she said simply, "because I'm not giving up on you, Asher Sullivan. Not now, not ever." In that moment, with the evening sun casting golden light through Martha's kitchen window and Josie's hand warm in his, Asher realized with startling clarity that he was falling in love with her. The thought should have terrified him. He had nothing to offer. No home, no security, nothing but debt and charred remains, but instead, it filled him with a determination he hadn't felt since before the fire. He would rebuild his ranch, not just for himself now, but for the possibility of a future with Josie. A future he hadn't dared to imagine until this moment. "Nor I you, Josie Valenti," he promised softly. "Nor I you." The day of the dance and auction dawned clear and bright, a perfect Wyoming summer day. The entire town had been transformed in preparation, with the town square decorated with bunting and lanterns, a platform erected for the musicians, and tables set up for the auction items. Asher, dressed in new clothes purchased with some of the fundraiser money over his initial objections, but Martha and Josie had insisted he couldn't attend looking like a vagrant, stood at the edge of the square, watching the final preparations with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They had raised just over $200, so far a remarkable sum for a town the size of Wilson. but still well short of the 500 they needed. "There you are," Josie's voice came from behind him, and Asher turned to find her approaching, looking more beautiful than he had ever seen her in a pale blue dress that complemented her coloring perfectly. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Just needed a moment to collect my thoughts," Asher admitted, his breath catching at the sight of her. "You look stunning." A blush colored Josie's cheeks, making her even more lovely. "Thank you," she said, smoothing her skirt self-consciously. "Mrs. Peterson helped me alter one of my old dresses." "It suits you," Asher said sincerely, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" As they walked together towards the town square, Asher could feel the eyes of the townspeople on them, could hear the whispers and see the knowing smiles. In a town as small as Wilson, nothing remained secret for long, and his growing attachment to Josie had apparently become common knowledge. "They're talking about us," he murmured to her, suddenly self-conscious. "Let them talk," Josie replied with a smile. "They've been doing it since I arrived in town. When will the schoolteacher find a husband? Is she too picky, too independent, and are you?" Asher asked, curious despite himself. "Too independent." Josie looked up at him, her green eyes serious despite her smile. "I value my independence," she said carefully. "But I also believe that the right partnership doesn't diminish one's independence, it enhances it." The implication of her words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Before Asher could respond, however, they were interrupted by Sheriff Tanner, who approached with an urgency that immediately put Asher on alert. "Sullivan," the sheriff said without preamble, "Hollister's here." Asher tensed, scanning the crowd until he spotted the tall, thin figure of the bank manager, standing near the auction tables with a supercilious expression. "What does he want?" "To check on your progress, I'd wager," Sheriff Tanner said grimly, "and to gloat if you're falling short." "We'll just have to make sure he doesn't have that opportunity," Josie said firmly, squeezing Asher's arm. "Come on, let's see what people have donated for the auction." The auction tables were laden with an impressive array of items: handcrafted furniture, quilts, preserved foods, tools, and more. Each donation represented the skill and generosity of the townsfolk, and Asher felt a surge of emotion at the tangible evidence of their support. "This is amazing," he said quietly to Josie. "Even if we don't raise enough, I'll never forget what everyone has done." "We'll raise enough," she assured him, her confidence unwavering. "I have faith." The dance began as the sun started to set, the musicians striking up a lively tune that soon had couples swirling around the makeshift dance floor. Asher, who hadn't danced since before the war, found himself being pulled into the festivities by Josie, her hand warm in his as she guided him through the steps he had nearly forgotten. "See," she laughed as they completed a turn without mishap. "You remember after all." "I have a good partner," he replied, surprising himself with the ease of the compliment. They danced several more sets until Sheriff Tanner announced it was time for the auction. The dancing paused as everyone gathered around the auction tables, ready to bid on the donated items. The auction proceeded briskly, with spirited bidding driving prices higher than expected. Tom Jenkins, to everyone's surprise, was one of the most aggressive bidders, purchasing several items at well above their value. When questioned, he simply shrugged and said, "Good business to support my customers." By the time the last item was sold, a handcrafted rocking chair that went to Martha Carson for an astonishing $50, the excitement in the air was palpable. Josie and Mrs. Peterson quickly tallied the proceeds, their faces growing increasingly animated as the total mounted. Finally, Josie stepped forward, her eyes seeking Asher in the crowd. When she found him, her smile was radiant. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying across the square. "Thanks to your incredible generosity, we have raised a total of $487. A cheer went up from the crowd, and Asher felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. $487. Just 13 short of their goal and far more than he had dared to hope for. But before he could process this remarkable news, another voice cut through the celebration. "A commendable effort," Franklin Hollister said, stepping forward. "But I believe the agreement was for $500, Mr. Sullivan. Not a penny less." A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned to the bank manager, whose thin face was set in an expression of smug satisfaction. "Unless you can produce the remaining $13 immediately, I'm afraid our arrangement stands. 2 days from now, the bank will take possession of your property." Asher felt a surge of anger at the man's petness, at his determination to deny him even this hard-won victory. $13, he repeated, his voice tight with controlled fury. "After all this, you'd take a man's land over $13. Business is business, Mr. Sullivan," Hollister replied coldly. "The bank's policies are clear." "I have $13. A new voice spoke up, and the crowd parted to reveal Timothy Reynolds, a boy of no more than 12 who worked odd jobs around town to help support his widowed mother. He stepped forward, clutching a small leather pouch. "I've been saving to buy a new fishing rod, but Mr. Sullivan can have it." Hollister's face reddened with anger as the boy approached Asher, holding out his savings with a solemn expression. "Now see here," the bank manager sputtered. "This is a matter between the bank and Mr. Sullivan, not some, I believe," Sheriff Tanner interrupted, stepping between Hollister and the boy, "that the agreement was for $500. If Mr. Sullivan has that amount from whatever source, the bank is obligated to honor its commitment." "I'll add 50 more," Tom Jenkins called out, digging into his pocket. "Make it an even $550 just to be sure." Hollister looked around at the faces of the townspeople, all watching him with varying degrees of disapproval, and visibly collected himself. "Very well," he said stiffly. "Bring the money to the bank on Monday, Mr. Sullivan, and we'll extend your loan as agreed." With that, he turned and strode away, his rigid back a testament to his displeasure. As soon as he was gone, the crowd erupted in cheers and congratulations. Asher, overwhelmed by the turn of events, found himself being clapped on the back, shaking hands, and receiving more genuine good wishes than he had experienced in years. But his eyes sought only one person. When he finally found Josie at the edge of the crowd, her face shining with joy and pride, he moved towards her as if drawn by an invisible force. "You did it," he said when he reached her, taking both her hands in his. "You saved my ranch. We did it," she corrected him gently. "All of us together. That's what community means, Asher. No one stands alone." The music had started again, a slow, sweet melody that seemed to envelop them in its warmth. Without thinking, Asher pulled Josie into his arms, leading her in a dance that felt like coming home. "I don't know how to thank you," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't need to thank me," she replied, her green eyes luminous in the lantern light. "Just build something beautiful with what we've saved, something that lasts." In that moment, with Josie in his arms and the future suddenly full of possibility again, Asher made a silent promise not just to rebuild his ranch, but to build a life worth living, one that honored the faith this remarkable woman had placed in him. The next morning, Asher woke early, his mind already racing with plans for the rebuilding. With the loan extension secured and the fundraiser money in hand, he could begin immediately, ordering lumber and supplies, hiring help for the major construction, and slowly but surely bringing Silver Creek Ranch back to life. He dressed quickly and made his way to Martha's kitchen, where he found both women already up, deep in conversation over coffee. They fell silent as he entered, exchanging a look that immediately put him on alert. "What's wrong?" he asked, pouring himself a cup from the pot on the stove. "Nothing's wrong," Martha assured him, though her expression suggested otherwise. "We were just discussing next steps." "I thought that was clear," Asher said, taking a seat at the table. "I'll go to the bank tomorrow, make the payment, and start ordering supplies. I figure I can have the barn up within a month, the house by winter." "And then?" Josie asked quietly, her eyes intent on his face. "Then I start rebuilding the herd, getting back to business," Asher replied, confused by the question. "What else would I do?" Another look passed between the women, this one laden with meaning Asher couldn't quite decipher. "I should get to the school," Josie said suddenly, rising from her chair. "The children will be waiting." "I'll walk you," Asher offered, standing as well, but Josie shook her head. "No need," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I'm sure you have plenty to do today. We'll talk later." Before Asher could respond, she was gone, leaving him staring after her in bewilderment. What was that about? He asked Martha, who was busying herself at the stove in a way that seemed deliberately avoiding his gaze. "Sit down, Asher," Martha said with a sigh, turning to face him. "We need to talk." Warily, Asher resumed his seat, a sense of foreboding settling over him. "About what?" "About Josie," Martha said bluntly, "and what your intentions are towards her." Asher blinked, taken aback by the directness of the question. "My intentions?" "Don't play dumb with me, young man," Martha scolded. "I've seen the way you look at her, the way you are when you're together. Half the town is betting on when you'll propose." "Propose?" Asher repeated, his voice rising in surprise. "We've barely known each other 2 weeks." "Sometimes 2 weeks is all it takes," Martha countered. "Especially 2 weeks like the ones you've had. Crisis has a way of showing people's true characters, and you two have seen the best in each other through all of this." Asher fell silent, considering her words. It was true that his feelings for Josie had developed with unexpected speed and intensity. What had begun as grudging gratitude had quickly evolved into admiration, friendship, and something deeper, something he had been hesitant to name, but that he now recognized as love. But the idea of marriage, of asking Josie to tie her future to his when he had so little to offer, seemed presumptuous at best, foolhardy at worst. "I care for her," he admitted finally. "More than I thought possible in such a short time, but I have nothing to give her, Martha. My ranch is in ashes, my future uncertain. What kind of man would ask a woman to share that kind of life? A man who recognizes that some treasures are worth more than gold or property," Martha replied gently. "Josie doesn't care about your ranch, Asher. She cares about you, your character, your heart, your determination. Those things weren't destroyed in the fire. She deserves better than a homeless rancher with more debt than assets," Asher insisted. "She deserves a man who loves her for who she is, who sees her value beyond her pretty face and kind heart," Martha countered. "A man who will be a true partner to her, supporting her dreams as she supports his. Are you that man, Asher Sullivan?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer Asher wasn't sure he was ready to give. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I want to be." Martha's expression softened. "Then that's a start. But Asher, don't wait too long to decide. Josie may be patient, but she's also practical. She won't wait forever for a man who can't make up his mind." With those parting words, Martha left him alone with his thoughts, which were more tumultuous than ever. Could he really consider marriage when his life was in such disarray? And yet, the thought of losing Josie, of watching her build a life with someone else, was unbearable. Asher spent the morning at his ranch, measuring and planning for the rebuilding. Several men from town joined him, offering advice and promises of help when the construction began in earnest. By midday, he had a rough blueprint for the new barn and was feeling more optimistic about the future than he had since the fire. As he sat in the shade of the lone tree that had survived the blaze, eating the lunch Martha had packed for him, Asher's thoughts returned to Josie and the question Martha had posed. Was he the man Josie deserved? Could he be? His ruminations were interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tanner, who dismounted and approached with a thoughtful expression. "Making progress?" the sheriff asked, nodding towards the cleared area where the barn would stand. "Some," Asher acknowledged. "Thanks to the town's help, I'm ahead of where I thought I'd be." "Good to hear," Sheriff Tanner said, settling himself on a nearby stump. "Got something to discuss with you if you've got a minute." Curious, Asher nodded, waiting for the older man to continue. "I've been thinking about your situation," the sheriff began, "and I've got a proposition for you. My brother-in-law in Montana, you remember I mentioned him before. He's looking to sell part of his herd. Good stock, fair price. He's willing to let you have 20 head on credit to be paid when they calve next spring." Asher straightened, surprised and cautiously optimistic. "That's generous. Why would he do that for someone he's never met?" "Because I vouched for you," Sheriff Tanner said simply. "And because he knows what it's like to start over with nothing. Did the same himself after the war. 20 head would be a solid start," Asher mused, already calculating how quickly he could build from there. "I'm grateful for the offer, Sheriff. There's more," the sheriff continued. "Doc Miller is selling his team of draft horses, says he's getting too old for farming and wants to focus on his medical practice. He's offering them to you at half price as his contribution to your rebuilding." "Half price is still more than I can afford right now," Asher pointed out. "He's willing to wait for payment until you're back on your feet," Sheriff Tanner assured him. "Said to consider it an investment in the community's future." Asher shook his head in wonder. Even after the fundraiser, the town's generosity continued to surprise him. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept," the sheriff advised. "Pride's a fine thing, Sullivan, but it won't rebuild your ranch. Sometimes the wisest course is to accept help when it's offered." It was a lesson Asher had been learning, painfully but thoroughly, over the past 2 weeks. "I'll accept," he said, the decision bringing with it a sense of rightness. "And I'll make sure they know their trust isn't misplaced." "Never doubted it," Sheriff Tanner said with satisfaction. "Now there's one more thing we need to discuss." "What's that?" Asher asked, curious about the sheriff's suddenly serious tone. "Miss Valenti," the sheriff said bluntly. "Half the town's talking about when you're going to make an honest woman of her." Asher groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Not you too. Martha Carson already gave me an earful this morning." "Smart woman, Martha," Sheriff Tanner observed. "She's seeing anything the rest of us are missing." "Only that I'm in no position to be thinking about marriage," Asher replied, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "I need to focus on rebuilding the ranch. And after that, there'll be something else," the sheriff said shrewdly. "Always is with men like you. Always one more thing to accomplish, one more goal to reach before you think you're worthy of happiness." The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. "It's not about being worthy," Asher protested, though even to his own ears the words rang hollow. "It's about having something to offer." "And what do you think Josie Valenti wants from a husband?" Sheriff Tanner asked. "Money, property, status." "Because if so, you don't know her very well at all." "Of course not," Asher said immediately. "Josie's not like that. She's what?" the sheriff prompted when Asher fell silent. "She's everything," Asher said softly, the admission coming from a place deep within him. "She's strength and kindness and unwavering faith. She's the most remarkable woman I've ever known." Then perhaps, Sheriff Tanner suggested gently, what you have to offer is exactly what she's looking for. Have you considered that? The question lingered in Asher's mind long after the sheriff had departed. Had he been so focused on what he lacked that he'd failed to recognize what he could give? Was his hesitation less about protecting Josie and more about protecting himself from the vulnerability of love? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land that had once been his pride and would be again, Asher came to a decision. He would rebuild his ranch, yes, but not at the expense of building a life with Josie if she would have him. The two goals weren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they were deeply intertwined, each giving purpose and meaning to the other. With this clarity came a sense of peace Asher hadn't felt since before the fire, perhaps not since before the war. Tomorrow, he would go to the bank, secure his land, and begin the physical rebuilding. And then, he would find Josie and begin building something infinitely more precious. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Wyoming summer day that seemed to mirror Asher's newfound hope. He dressed with care in his one good shirt, another donation from the townspeople, and made his way to the bank as soon as it opened, the fundraiser money secure in an envelope inside his jacket. Franklin Hollister was waiting for him, his thin face set in its usual expression of cold disdain. But today, not even the bank manager's obvious disappointment at Asher's ability to meet the payment could dampen his spirits. "The full amount," Asher said simply, placing the envelope on Hollister's desk. $550 as agreed. Hollister counted the money slowly, as if hoping to find it short, but eventually nodded in reluctant acknowledgement. "Very well, Mr. Sullivan. The bank will extend your loan for an additional 30 days, at which time the remaining balance will be due in full." "I understand," Asher replied, his tone confident. "And I'll be ready." As he left the bank, the weight that had been pressing on his shoulders since the fire seemed to lift, allowing him to stand straighter, breathe deeper. His land was secure, at least for now, and he had plans in place for the rebuilding. But there was one more crucial piece of his future that needed to be addressed. Josie would be at the schoolhouse now, teaching the children of Wilson their letters and numbers, history and geography. Asher hesitated, unwilling to interrupt her work but equally unwilling to wait until the end of the school day to speak with her. Finally, he decided on a compromise. He would leave a note asking her to meet him at the ranch when school was dismissed. The note delivered, Asher returned to Silver Creek, where the real work of rebuilding was set to begin. The lumber he had ordered with part of the fundraiser money was being delivered that morning, and several men from town had volunteered their time to help with the construction of the barn, the first and most essential structure for a working ranch. By the time Josie arrived in the late afternoon, the foundation of the barn was laid out and the first support beams were being raised. Asher saw her approach in a small buggy borrowed from Martha Carson, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun, and felt his heart rate accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor of the day. He excused himself from the work crew and walked to meet her, suddenly acutely aware of his dirty clothes and sweat-dampened hair. But when Josie smiled at him, her green eyes lighting up with pleasure at the sight of him, his self-consciousness faded. "You've made progress already," she observed, looking past him to the skeletal beginnings of the barn. "It's a start," Asher agreed, offering his hand to help her down from the buggy. "The men from town have been incredible, working as if it were their own barn they were raising." "In a way it is," Josie said thoughtfully. "What happens to one of us happens to all of us in a community like Wilson." Her words reminded Asher of how much his perspective had changed in the past 2 weeks. Before the fire, He had seen himself as separate from the town, a solitary figure whose success or failure affected no one but himself. Now, he understood the intricate web of connections that bound him to the people of Wilson and they to him. "I'm beginning to understand that," he admitted, still holding her hand. "Thanks to you." Josie's smile softened, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Your note said you wanted to talk to me." "I do," Asher confirmed, suddenly nervous. "Would you walk with me? There's something I want to show you." Curious, Josie nodded, allowing him to lead her away from the construction site, past the cleared area where his house had stood, towards the small creek that gave the ranch its name. The water sparkled in the late afternoon light, creating a peaceful setting that felt removed from the activity and noise of the rebuilding. "It's beautiful here," Josie said softly, her gaze taking in the rolling landscape, the distant mountains, the clear water of the creek. "I can see why you love it so much." "I do love it," Asher agreed, turning to face her fully. "But I've realized something important, Josie. The land, the ranch, they're not what matter most. What matters is who you share it with." Josie's eyes widened slightly, her breath catching. "Asher, please, let me finish," he said gently, taking both her hands in his. 2 weeks ago, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered when the fire destroyed my ranch. I was ready to give up, to walk away and start over somewhere else. But you wouldn't let me. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. You showed me what real strength looks like, not the ability to stand alone, but the courage to lean on others when you need to. Josie's eyes had filled with tears, but they were the kind that enhanced rather than diminished her beauty. "I only showed you what was already there," she said softly. "The strength was yours all along." "Maybe," Asher conceded, "but I never would have found it without you. You didn't just help me rebuild my ranch, Josie. You helped me rebuild my faith in myself, in others, in the possibility of happiness." Taking a deep breath, Asher released her hands only to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that glinted in the sunlight. It was a ring, simple but elegant, a small diamond set in gold. "I know it's fast," he said, his voice low and intense. "I know we've only really known each other for 2 weeks, but sometimes when you know, you know. And I know that I love you, Josie Valenti. I know that I want to build a life with you, here on this land if you'll have it, or anywhere else if you won't. I know that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and that I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." Kneeling before her on the soft grass by the creek, Asher held up the ring purchased that morning with the last of his savings, a final act of faith in the future. "Josie Valenti, will you marry me?" For a moment that felt like eternity, Josie stood silent, her tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Then, with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder. "Yes, Asher Sullivan, I will marry you." Joy surged through Asher like a physical force as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to take her in his arms. Their first kiss was everything he had imagined and more tender and passionate, a promise and a fulfillment all at once. When they finally parted, both breathless, Asher rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to create any more distance between them than necessary. "I don't have much to offer yet," he said, a last remnant of his earlier doubts surfacing. "The ranch will take time to rebuild." "We'll build it together," Josie assured him, her green eyes luminous with happiness. "And we already have everything that truly matters." As they walked back to the construction site, hand in hand, the setting sun painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink, Asher felt a profound sense of gratitude for the fire that had destroyed his ranch. For in losing everything, he had found something infinitely more precious, a love built on faith, strengthened by adversity, and promising a future brighter than anything he could have imagined. The news of their engagement spread through Wilson like wildfire, eliciting reactions that ranged from smug satisfaction. "I knew it all along," Martha Carson declared, to genuine delight. Sheriff Tanner actually smiled, a rare enough occurrence to be noteworthy. The townspeople, already invested in Asher's rebuilding efforts, now embraced the upcoming wedding as a community celebration, offering everything from Mrs. Peterson's services for Josie's wedding dress to the use of the church for the ceremony. "They act as if they are all personally responsible for our happiness," Asher commented one evening as he and Josie sat on the porch of Martha's house after supper, enjoying the cool breeze and each other's company. "In a way they are," Josie replied, her hand comfortably entwined with his. "They brought us together after all." "The fire brought us together," Asher corrected, still sometimes marveling at the strange twist of fate that had led to their meeting in such circumstances. "No," Josie said thoughtfully, "the fire was just the catalyst. It was the community's response and yours that brought us together. Without their support, without your willingness to accept help and rebuild, we might never have truly known each other." Asher considered her words, recognizing the truth in them. Before the fire, he and Josie had been barely acquainted, exchanging polite nods in town but never truly connecting. It had taken a crisis to reveal the deep compatibility of their characters, their shared values, and the powerful attraction that now seemed as essential as breathing. "When do you want to get married?" he asked, changing the subject to one that had been on his mind frequently. "I know traditionally there would be a long engagement, but nothing about our relationship has been traditional," Josie finished for him with a smile. "I don't need a long engagement, Asher. I know what I want." "And what's that?" he asked, though her answer was already written in the loving way she looked at him. "A life with you," she said simply. "The sooner it begins, the better." They set the date for 6 weeks, hence long enough for the basic rebuilding of the ranch to be completed, short enough to satisfy their growing impatience to begin their life together. The barn would be finished first, then a small but comfortable cabin that could be expanded later as their family grew. The thought of children, of building not just structures, but a legacy, filled Asher with a deep, quiet joy that he had never expected to experience again after the loss of his parents. The weeks that followed were filled with intense activity, as Asher divided his time between the physical labor of rebuilding and the planning of their future. True to his word, Sheriff Tanner arranged for the cattle from his brother-in-law in Montana, and Doc Miller's draft horses proved to be exactly what Asher needed for the heavy work of running a ranch. Josie continued her teaching duties, but spent every free moment at the ranch, working alongside Asher and the other volunteers, her presence a constant reminder of why he was working so hard. In the evenings, they would often sit by the creek, planning their future, sharing their hopes and dreams, learning each other's histories and habits in the accelerated intimacy of their unusual courtship. "Tell me about your family," Asher asked one such evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You've heard all about mine, but you rarely talk about yours." Josie was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "There's not much to tell," she said finally. "My parents died when I was young, my father in a mining accident, my mother from consumption a year later. I was raised by my aunt in Philadelphia, a stern but fair woman who made sure I received an education." "Is that why you became a teacher?" Asher asked, struck by the parallel of their early losses. "Partly," Josie acknowledged. "Education was my ticket to independence, and I wanted to give that opportunity to others. But also, I've always loved watching the moment when a child understands something new, that light in their eyes, that sense of accomplishment. It's a kind of magic. You'll be a wonderful mother, Asher said softly, the words coming naturally despite the intimacy they implied. Josie's smile was radiant, her green eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "And you'll be a wonderful father," she replied, her confidence in him unwavering. "How many children do you want?" he asked, suddenly eager to know every detail of her vision for their future. "At least 3, Josie answered without hesitation. "Maybe 4. I always wished for siblings growing up." "4 sounds perfect," Asher agreed, imagining their home filled with children's laughter, with the chaos and joy of a large family. 2 boys and 2 girls. "You say that as if we can choose," Josie laughed, leaning against him comfortably. "We can hope," Asher replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and drawing her closer. "And I've become quite the believer in the power of hope lately." As the wedding day approached, the pace of the rebuilding intensified. The barn was completed ahead of schedule, thanks to the dedicated work of the townsmen, and the cabin was taking shape with remarkable speed. It would be ready just in time for the wedding, allowing Asher and Josie to begin their married life in their own home, simple as it was. The night before the wedding, Asher stood on the porch of the newly completed cabin, looking out over his land in the moonlight. The barn stood solid against the star-filled sky, the corral beside it ready for the horses and cattle that would form the foundation of his rebuilding herd. The cabin, though small, was sturdy and well-crafted, with plenty of room for expansion as their family grew. It was not yet the prosperous ranch he had lost to the fire, but it was beginning a foundation upon which he and Josie would build their future together. And somehow, that seemed even more valuable than what had been destroyed. "Penny for your thoughts," Martha Carson's voice came from behind him, and Asher turned to see his landlady, soon to be his former landlady, approaching from the path that led to town. "Just thinking about how much has changed in 6 weeks," Asher replied, making room for her on the porch. "About how lucky I am." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Martha said firmly, settling herself on the porch railing. "You worked for this, Asher, you and Josie both." "With a lot of help," Asher reminded her, his gratitude for the town's support still strong. "That's what community is for," Martha said simply. "To help each other through the hard times so we can all enjoy the good ones." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, looking out over the ranch that had risen from the ashes. Finally, Martha spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You know, when my Harold died, I thought my life was over. 30 years we'd been married, and suddenly he was gone. I couldn't imagine going on without him." Asher remained silent, sensing she had more to say. "But then the people of Wilson stepped up," Martha continued. "Bringing food, helping with chores, just sitting with me when the silence got too loud. They reminded me that even though Harold was gone, I wasn't alone. That life goes on and can still be good, even after loss." "They're good people," Asher agreed softly. "The best," Martha nodded. "And now you and Josie are part of that legacy of caring. What you've built here, it's not just for yourselves. It's for the community, for the future generations who will learn from your example what it means to face adversity with courage and faith." Her words struck a chord in Asher, articulating something he had felt but not fully understood. His rebuilding was not just a personal triumph, but a testament to the power of community, of faith, of love in the face of devastation. "I never saw it that way," he admitted, "but you're right. What Josie and I have built, what we will build, is bigger than just us." "That's the beauty of love," Martha said with a smile. "It multiplies, not divides. The more you give, the more you have." As Martha left him to his thoughts, Returning to town to help with the final wedding preparations, Asher felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow, he would marry the woman who had helped him rebuild not just his ranch, but his faith in himself and in the future. Together, they would continue building a home, a family, a legacy of love and resilience that would endure long after they were gone. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. The Wyoming sky, a brilliant blue canvas, stretched over the rolling landscape. Asher, dressed in a new suit purchased for the occasion, stood in the small church in Wilson, surrounded by what seemed like the entire population of the town. Sheriff Tanner stood beside him as his best man, an honor the older man had accepted with gruff emotion. "Nervous?" the sheriff asked as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "No," Asher replied honestly. "For the first time in as long as I can remember, I'm absolutely certain about where I'm supposed to be." The sheriff nodded in understanding, a rare smile softening his weathered features. "That's how it should be. My Elizabeth and I had 42 good years together before she passed. Never once doubted we were meant to be." Before Asher could respond, the church door opened and a hush fell over the congregation. And then Josie was there, walking slowly down the aisle on the arm of Doc Miller, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her own father. She was radiant in a simple white dress that Mrs. Peterson had helped her make, her honey-brown hair adorned with wildflowers, her green eyes shining with love as they met Asher's across the church. In that moment, all the doubts and fears that had plagued Asher since the fire, all the uncertainty about the future vanished like morning mist in the sun. This was right. This was perfect. This was the beginning of everything. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion, the preacher's words washing over Asher as he focused on Josie's face, on the feel of her hands in his as they spoke their vows, on the weight of the simple gold band as he slid it onto her finger. And then they were pronounced husband and wife, and he was kissing her amid the cheers and applause of the entire town. And Asher knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger for having already weathered the worst storm of their lives. The celebration that followed was a testament to the town's affection for the couple. Tables laden with food and drink were set up in the town square. A band played lively music for dancing, and toasts were raised to the future of Asher and Josie Sullivan. Even Franklin Hollister made an appearance, offering a stiff but seemingly sincere congratulation and announcing, to everyone's surprise, that in light of the circumstances, the bank would be extending Asher's loan repayment schedule at a reduced interest rate. "Consider it a wedding gift," the bank manager said, his usual cold demeanor softened slightly by the festive atmosphere or perhaps by the influence of his wife, a kindly woman who had been among the most enthusiastic supporters of the fundraiser. As the celebration continued into the evening, Asher and Josie found a moment of quiet together, stepping away from the dancing and laughter to share a private moment before departing for their new home. "Happy, Mrs. Sullivan?" Asher asked, his arms around her waist, his heart full to bursting with love for this remarkable woman who was now his wife. "More than I ever thought possible," Josie replied, her green eyes luminous with joy. "And you, Mr. Sullivan? Any regrets about tying yourself to a stubborn schoolteacher who wouldn't let you give up?" "Only that I didn't meet you sooner," Asher said honestly. "Think of all the time we could have had together." "We have the rest of our lives," Josie reminded him, stretching up to kiss him softly. "And I intend to make every moment count." As they made their way back to Silver Creek Ranch to their home in the wagon decorated with flowers and ribbons by the town's children, Asher reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. 6 weeks ago, He had stood among the ashes of his life, believing he had lost everything of value. Now, with Josie beside him and a future full of promise ahead, he understood that what had seemed like an ending had in fact been a beginning, the first step on a path that had led him to the greatest happiness he had ever known. "What are you thinking about?" Josie asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "About how sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you turns out to be the best," Asher replied, squeezing her hand. "If not for the fire, we might never have found each other." "I think we would have," Josie said confidently. "Some things are meant to be, Asher. Some connections are too strong to be denied, no matter what path we take to find them." As they reached the ranch, their ranch now, Asher helped Josie down from the wagon, then swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their new home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sullivan," he said softly, setting her down in the small but cozy main room of the cabin, illuminated by the warm glow of lamps that Martha had thoughtfully lit before their arrival. "Home," Josie repeated, looking around with evident satisfaction at the simple furniture, the colorful quilt on the bed, the shelves already filled with her books, and the few personal items Asher had managed to salvage from the fire. "It's perfect, Asher. Everything I could have wanted." "It will get better," he promised, already envisioning the expansions they would make as their family grew. "Bigger, more comfortable." "I don't need bigger or more comfortable," Josie assured him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I just need you. Everything else is just extra." As they sealed this new beginning with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership, Asher Sullivan, once a solitary figure determined to stand alone against the world, embraced the interconnectedness that had brought him to this moment. The fire had destroyed his ranch, but it had also burned away the isolation he had built around himself, allowing him to see clearly what truly mattered. Not the buildings or the livestock or the land itself, but the love and community that gave them meaning. With Josie by his side, he would rebuild Silver Creek Ranch into something even better than it had been before, not just a successful business, but a home filled with love, laughter, and the kind of faith that could withstand any trial. Together, they would create a legacy not just of prosperity, but of resilience, compassion, and unwavering commitment to each other and to the community that had brought them together. And as they began the first night of their married life in the home they would build together, both Asher and Josie knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced the fire, with courage, determination, and an unshakable faith in each other, and in the power of love to rebuild what was broken and make it stronger than before. 10 years later, Asher stood on the porch of the expanded farmhouse that had replaced the original cabin, watching as Josie gathered their 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, just as he had hoped for the journey into town. The oldest, 8-year-old Andrew, was the spitting image of his father with his dark hair and blue eyes, while 6-year-old Abigail had inherited her mother's honey-brown locks and bright smile. The youngest 2, 4-year-old twins Michael and Margaret, were a perfect blend of their parents, with Asher's height and Josie's green eyes. "Daddy, come on," Abigail called impatiently, already seated in the wagon beside her mother. "We'll be late for the celebration." "Coming, princess," Asher replied with a smile, taking one last look at the thriving ranch that surrounded them. The barn, the first structure they had rebuilt after the fire, had been joined by a larger stable for the growing herd of horses, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands they now employed, and various outbuildings that testified to the prosperity of Silver Creek Ranch. What had once been ashes was now one of the most successful operations in the county, a testament to hard work, determination, and the unwavering support of a community. As Asher joined his family in the wagon, Josie gave him a knowing smile. "Admiring your handiwork again," she teased, though the pride in her voice matched his own. "Our handiwork," he corrected, taking the reins. "None of this would exist without you, Josie." "True," she agreed with a laugh, the same joyful sound that had first captured his heart a decade ago. "But I believe it was your strong back that built most of these buildings. And your unwavering faith that made me believe it was possible," Asher replied, his voice softening with emotion. Even after 10 years of marriage, the depth of his gratitude for this woman, for the life they had built together, sometimes overwhelmed him. The town of Wilson had grown along with Silver Creek Ranch over the past decade, but it retained the close-knit community spirit that had saved Asher in his darkest hour. Today's celebration was in honor of that spirit, the 10th anniversary of what the townspeople had come to call the Great Rebuild, when they had rallied to save one of their own from disaster. As they drove into town, Asher and Josie pointed out landmarks to their children, sharing stories of the fire and the remarkable response of the community. It had become a family tradition, this retelling of their origin story, a way to ensure that their children understood the values that had shaped their parents' lives. "And that's where Mama lived when she was the schoolteacher," Asher said, gesturing to Martha Carson's house, now occupied by her niece since Martha's peaceful passing 3 years prior. "Before she saved Daddy from being a grumpy old hermit," Andrew added with a mischievous grin, clearly repeating a phrase he had heard many times before. "Andrew," Josie scolded, though her eyes danced with amusement. "Your father was never a hermit, just a bit solitary." "Until you came along," Asher finished, giving his wife a look of such love that the children groaned in unison, accustomed to their parents' displays of affection. The town square was already filled with people when they arrived, many faces familiar, some new as the town had grown over the years. Sheriff Tanner, now retired but still a respected figure in the community, waved to them from his seat of honor near the bandstand. Tom Jenkins, his general store now the largest in the county, greeted them warmly as they passed. And there, by the refreshment table, stood Franklin Hollister, still the bank manager but softened considerably over the years, especially since the birth of his first grandchild. The Sullivan family. Mayor Thompson, formerly just plain Jim Thompson, owner of the hardware store until his election 3 years ago, called out, raising a glass in greeting. "The guests of honor have arrived." A cheer went up from the crowd, embarrassing Asher as it always did, though he had learned to accept the town's admiration with better grace than in his younger days. Josie, ever the more socially adept of the pair, smiled and waved, helping the younger children down from the wagon while Asher secured the horses. "Speech, speech." Someone called, and soon others took up the chant, making it clear that Asher would not escape this particular tradition of the annual celebration. With a resigned sigh that fooled no one, Asher made his way to the bandstand, Josie and the children following. Looking out over the faces of the people who had become not just neighbors but family over the past decade, he felt the familiar surge of emotion that always accompanied this moment. 10 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed square, I stood among the ashes of everything I had built, certain that my life in Wilson was over. I was ready to leave, to start fresh somewhere else, to carry my grief and my pride to some new place where no one knew me or what I had lost. Nods of remembrance passed through the older members of the crowd, while the newer arrivals listened attentively, familiar with the story that had become part of the town's folklore. But a stubborn schoolteacher had other ideas, Asher continued, smiling down at Josie, who stood beside him with their youngest daughter in her arms. She believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. She reminded me that true strength isn't found in standing alone, but in accepting help when it's needed and in offering it when it's not. "Here, here," Sheriff Tanner called out, raising his glass again. "What happened next was nothing short of a miracle," Asher said, his voice thick with emotion. "This town, all of you came together to help one man save his land. But in doing so, you did something far more important. You reminded me what community means. You showed me that we're all connected, that what happens to one of us happens to all of us." Looking out at the faces watching him, some weathered by years of Wyoming sun and wind, some young and fresh, all united in this moment of shared history, Asher felt the same sense of belonging, of rightness, that had first taken root in him during those desperate days after the fire. "Silver Creek Ranch rose from the ashes stronger than before," he continued, "not because of my efforts alone, but because of all of you. Every nail hammered, every dollar donated, every hour of labor freely given, they all became part of the foundation of what we built. And what we built was not just a ranch, but a home. Not just buildings, but a legacy of love and support that our children," he gestured to the 4 young Sullivans, standing proud beside their parents, "will carry forward into the future." Asher paused, gathering his thoughts for the conclusion of a speech he had given in various forms every year for the past decade. 10 years ago, I thought I had lost everything in the fire. Today, I know that what I found in its aftermath was worth far more than what was destroyed. I found a wife who challenges and completes me." He smiled at Josie, who blew him a kiss in return. "Children who bring me more joy than I ever thought possible, and a community that has become the extended family I never knew I needed." So today, as we celebrate not just the rebuilding of one ranch but the spirit of Wilson itself, I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. For your generosity, your hard work, your unwavering support. But most of all, for teaching me the true meaning of faith, not just belief in things unseen, but trust in the goodness of people, and in the power of love to rebuild what seems beyond repair. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing across the square and bringing a flush of embarrassment to Asher's face. But as he stepped down from the bandstand, surrounded by his family and embraced by neighbors and friends, the embarrassment gave way to a deep, abiding gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Asher and Josie found a quiet moment together, watching their children play with the other town youngsters in a game of tag that ranged across the square. "Did you ever imagine this?" Josie asked softly, leaning against him in a gesture as familiar and necessary as breathing. "That night when you stood looking at the ruins of your ranch, did you ever think your life could be so full?" "Never," Asher admitted, his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "I couldn't see past the loss, but you could. You always had more faith than me." "Not more," Josie corrected gently. "Just different. You had faith in the tangible, in hard work, in the land, in what you could build with your own 2 hands. I had faith in the intangible, in love, in community, in second chances. Together, we had exactly what we needed." Looking at their 4 beautiful children, at the town that had become a true home, at the woman who had transformed his life with nothing but her unwavering belief in what was possible, Asher felt a sense of completion that transcended mere happiness. "I love you, Josie Sullivan," he said simply, the words worn smooth with daily use but no less powerful for their familiarity. "Every day, I thank God for the fire that brought you into my life." "And I love you, Asher Sullivan," Josie replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly, ignoring the playful groans of their children who had paused in their game to witness this display of affection. Every day, I thank God for the stubborn man who finally learned to accept help when it was offered. As they rejoined the celebration, hand in hand, surrounded by the community that had become their extended family, Asher reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the devastation of the fire to the triumph of rebuilding, from the loneliness of loss to the richness of love and family, it had been a path he could never have foreseen or chosen for himself. But standing here now, with Josie beside him and their children's laughter ringing in his ears, Asher knew with absolute certainty that it had been the right path all along. For in losing everything, he had found what truly mattered: a love that could withstand any trial, a community that would stand together in the face of adversity, and a faith that saw not just what was, but what could be. And that, Asher Sullivan reflected as he watched his wife gather their children for the journey home to the ranch they had built together, was the greatest rebuilding of all.